Let's talk to Lord Sumption now. He's a former Supreme Court Justice, author and historian, and he has been speaking out since the very start of the first lockdown over the huge loss of freedom we are seeing from these lockdowns. Good morning to you, Lord Sumption.
Good morning.
Very much appreciate you joining us. So much of the debate has been about just the facts and figures. Are we going to see more deaths with or without a lockdown? Your concern, though, is about the fundamental freedoms that we are giving up and which MPs are going to happily vote for, regardless of the facts and figures, it would appear, regardless of what information they get. What are your chief concerns?
Well, I've got a number of concerns about the containment measures and a number of concerns about the lack of accountability and answerability to Parliament. The concerns about the countermeasures are essentially that they are not effective, they are not discriminate, and they carry insufferable social and economic costs. The government was warned right at the outset, back in February, that lockdowns do not reduce deaths in the longer term. What they do is they push them into the period after they are lifted, and therefore, unless you have a permanent lockdown, they are not going to make any significant difference. The government's answer to this is to say, well, but the NHS may be overwhelmed if we don't have a delay, if we don't kick the can down the road for a bit. The problem about that is there's a serious issue of trust here, because the government has spent 6 or 7 months now putting forward a hyped up view of things, stoking up fear. And it looks very much as if the latest charts are another example of this. We don't have the underlying material which is said to justify these figures, and so we can't be sure. But some of the figures are simply extravagant. The suggestion that we could be suffering up to 4,000 deaths a day, for example, is quite extraordinary.
Well, it's already been debunked. I mean, it was debunked on Sunday night. That what I find amazing is the Prime Minister's still talking about this in Commons on Monday.
It was debunked by showing that the graphs indicate that we should already have had death figures several times what we've actually experienced, and this has not worked out. In fact, the 4,000 a day figure would put us ahead of any country in the world, including India, which has had a failed lockdown policy and has a population 20 times of ours. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. The Prime Minister said in his press conference on Saturday, we have got to be humble in the face of nature. Well, I don't see any sign of humility from the policies that he then proceeded to announce.
But this is it, and we are looking at huge infringements of people's civil liberties. And yet the polls keep showing more than 70% of people support these. Now, they may find they're not quite so supportive after a few weeks of being locked in their homes in the miserable rain and worrying about their jobs. But it is extraordinary how willing people are to not only demand other people's freedoms are taken away, but also to give up their own. Why do you think that is? Because are we supposed to be a freedom-loving nation?
I think the problem is that that fear is the main pillar of every authoritarian government. And fear has been skillfully, and I fear deliberately, employed throughout this crisis in order to justify ministerial policies and to produce compliance. The reality is that if you frighten people enough, yes, they will surrender their freedoms, and that is what we have seen. I think that the degree of public support may be less than 70%, but there's clearly a majority in favour, and I think that this is the result of the immoderate terms in which the risks have been presented by the government.
Yeah, I was with social media yesterday, and we were talking about not 4,000 people a day are going to die in spit. And someone was saying, well, one death a day is too many, and that's the territory we're in now. The sort of sanctification of life, and it's just COVID does not realising. I think most people until very recently, this stat being put out, between 1,600 and 1,700 people die every single day of lots of different things. COVID isn't even in the top 10 of killers at the current time, and this is the concern. Do you think that we've just sort of, almost collectively, not just as a nation, it looks like lots of Europe as well, America, taken leave of our senses?
Well, there are people who believe that saving lives is the only thing that counts. But the fact is there are no absolute values in this area. There are only pluses and minuses. And you've got to weigh the value of saving lives against the value of blighting the lives of people who are going to survive. A world in which talented musicians and engineering graduates are obliged to abandon their skills and stack shelves in supermarkets is a world, in fact, which no sensible person should want to live in. We have got to look at the quality of life and not just at its quantity or duration.
Yeah, that's a big concern. Are you also worried that, okay, we say we do a lockdown, I mean, let's say it works in inverted commas, even though, of course, infection rates are already going down. So, of course, it'll work. That was what was going to happen anyway. That's how these things happen. 2nd of December, we're back out into sort of tier restrictions. We go through the winter. Eventually, everyone gets tired of it all. And we get back to some semblance of normality in the early spring. Do you think we're going to get all of our freedoms back again? We've got people telling us where we can and can't buy booze, which we've always had that to a certain extent, who people can sleep with, who people can mix with, who you can spend time with, how long you can spend time with, how far away you can stand from them and the like, wearing masks on trains and the like. Do you think we're going to get all of our freedoms back and we're going to go back to the old normal?
Well, the government, all governments, this is not just the present one, have a long record of keeping emergency powers alive long after the need for them has ended. And we have seen this in COVID itself, when in May and June, the lockdown was continued after the original reason for it, which was to, quote, save, unquote, the NHS, had passed because the crisis, the facilities of the NHS were less than half used. So there is a problem about this. I think there is a serious danger of a change in the relationship between the state and the citizen, which will lead to a much more authoritarian style of government. Governments have achieved a great deal of power through fear, and they will not forget that technique.